At this point, I'm convinced that I was born a century too late. And let me know in the comments below if you can relate to this, because it seems like the more time that passes, the less I can relate to the world and the people around me. And I don't think this is coincidence. I think there's a very specific reason for this. And I think the reason is because the people that were born between 1980 and 1989, I think we're the forgotten generation. We don't really fit in. We're not millennials and we're not Gen Xers. We're this weird in-between generation that kind of has a hard time relating to the stuff that we are surrounded with today, because our generation is actually the generation that ushered in all of the things that have taken over our daily lives. If you really think about it, cell phones, social media, the internet, our generation lived through that. And I would say that our generation is the last generation that is going to know the old world. And I think that's why it's hard to relate to the new world, because we remember what it's like back then. We remember the life without the internet. And I will say that the life without the internet was a grand life. It was pretty fantastic. I mean, the way I was raised and the way my friends were raised and most of the people I know that are in my generation, it was like the Lord of the Flies, but with Nintendos and bicycles. It was freaking amazing. Those were the days that we were running around outside all day long, riding our bikes, getting dirty, getting hurt, doing a bunch of stupid stuff that we would learn very hard lessons from. And those lessons would eventually shape us into the people that we would eventually become. Back in those days, I just remember being wild and free. My parents would cut me loose first thing in the morning. I would leave the house and I would not return until after sundown. And we didn't have cell phones, so there was no way for them to check in on us. They just assumed that we were okay and we would eventually come back home. And we always did. And that's just how life was. I grew up on a farm and both my parents worked. They would leave to go to work first thing in the morning, leaving my brother and I home alone pretty much all day long. And we ran the household. We were free range. We kind of did what we wanted. We came and go as we pleased. And our parents trusted us. And they trusted us, I believe, because we were properly disciplined. We knew that if we messed up, there was going to be a belt waiting on us when we got back home. And I still remember the day I started kindergarten. Our principal had a meeting with us in the cafeteria, and he told us point blank that if you misbehave, then we have a paddle and you are going to get bent over our knee and we're going to bust your butt with this paddle. And oh, by the way, it has holes in it so that it cuts through the air faster and it's more aerodynamic so that it can hit your butt harder and it will hurt worse. I still remember that. And that is 100% legit. That is true. That is how we were raised. And our generation is one of the last generations that knew that kind of discipline. Because nowadays, if you discipline your kids in that way, you can go to prison. It's a different world now. But again, we were brought up in the world where we were going through that transition phase, where all these things were being phased out, all the old ways of doing things. Another prime example of that, talking about school, is participation trophies. I grew up in a time where that didn't exist. You were either first or you were last. And that's how we were raised. And it bred healthy competition. It made you work harder because you knew that if you wanted to be the best, you had to train like the best. You had to put in the work. But today, you win no matter what. So what incentive is there to actually push yourself, to actually improve? And I would say that there's not much incentive at all. And maybe that's why people these days don't really have that drive. They don't have the ambition like we used to have back in the day. In school, I also remember the transition from full contact sports and full contact games and stuff on the playground to tag and touch sports and touch games, because for some reason full contact sports and games were a little too harsh. So we had to soften ourselves up. Things have changed in a very drastic way, and we lived through that change. And don't get me wrong, there's other generations that lived through that change as well, the older generations. But again, we are the last generation to have experienced the old world. And all these things happened as we were being raised. And when things happen when you're in that developmental phase, it sticks with you. It's ingrained in us. And since we remember all these old ways of doing things, and now we're in this world where the old ways of doing things are completely gone, and we fully transitioned into this new world, it can be very hard to adapt to that, even after all these years. And it can be very hard to relate. And that's what I've found that I'm experiencing. And sometimes that causes me to want to just withdraw from society and just be here alone on my farm with my dog and not be around people, not be involved and not participate in this new way of doing things. And I can tell you for certain that when I do that, I am at peace. And I think that's because of the way I was raised specifically, being on a farm and not being around all this stuff. Even as I was growing up, I was far removed from that stuff, more than the average person, I would say, because I was in nature. I was outside. I was playing in the yard with my friends. I was getting dirty. I was catching animals. I was hurting myself. I was learning all the hard lessons that would eventually shape me into the person I am now. And I feel bad for these kids nowadays that are being brought up in this new world that will never have the chance to experience that. And don't get me wrong, it is still possible to experience that way of living, but it's much more difficult because most of the population now are in cities, and the barrier to entry to get into nature is a little more difficult. And not only that, but it's also more difficult to remove yourself from technology and the new ways of doing things. When you're raised on cell phones and social media and the internet, it can be pretty hard to distance yourself from that. And if that's what you know and it's what you love, maybe you don't want to. Maybe you're completely content and happy being in that digital realm. But for those of us who were born between 1980 and 1989, that forgotten generation, the feral children of this world that still remember the old ways of doing things, I feel that in large part, we do want to get away from that. We want to get back to the old ways of doing things because things were so much simpler and life was less stressful. We had a lot less worry. We simply didn't have access to all this stimulation and all these things that are competing for our attention. We were raised in a time where the internet came on a CD. They used to ship out those AOL discs and you had to stick it in your computer and you would get like 30 days free. And it wasn't just the internet, it was dial-up internet, which worked off a phone line, and it was very, very slow. So if you wanted to load a picture, it would take you about 30 minutes. And that was only if somebody else wasn't on the phone or if somebody wasn't trying to call your house, because if that happened, then it would kick you off the internet, or your mom and dad would bust into your room and tell you to get off the internet so that they could use the phone. I'm still old enough to remember the old Atari, Nintendo, and Sega game cartridges that wouldn't work half the time. So you had to pull the cartridge out and blow on it and then put it back in there, and you had to hit the reset button 1,000 times, and eventually, maybe it would work. I still remember looking forward to the weekend because we knew that meant we were going to go to Video Vault or Blockbuster and we were going to rent a movie that was on a VHS tape that you had to please be kind rewind before you turned it back in, or else they would charge you like 50 cents or $1. I still remember back then, TV would actually shut off after a certain time. And I'm not talking about the TV itself would turn off. I'm talking about there was no TV on after a certain time at night. And it would not come back on again until in the morning. And when it came on again in the morning, it was infomercials. And no kid wanted to watch that, so what did we do instead? We went outside. We experienced the real natural world. And back in those days, we didn't have as many conveniences as we have today. Living on a farm, we grew and produced most of our own food, so that meant a lot of work. We were in the garden all the time. We were hunting. We were fishing. If you wanted to do something as simple as change the channel on the TV, you had to get up and turn the knob. And in a lot of cases, you had to go outside the house and grab the 20-foot tall pole and twist it around. It had a big pair of channel locks on there, vice grips. You had to twist the pole so that you could turn the antenna and tune the station in. Your mom and dad would be inside yelling at you, "Hold it right there, turn it back a little bit, turn it the other way." And you're out there cranking on what is essentially a massive lightning rod. And sometimes you would be out there in the middle of a storm trying to get the station to tune in enough where you could actually see the picture. And 99% of the time, you could never get it just right. So you would still have massive static on the screen. It wasn't about having full HD or, 1080p or 4K or any of that stuff. You were just happy to be able to see something. And the generation today, they wouldn't even be able to survive that, because now everything has to be the latest and greatest piece of technology. Everything has to be high definition. And if the web page takes more than a half a second to load, or if whatever you're watching doesn't catch your attention in the first 2 seconds, or if there's even the slightest bit of pixelization, we tune out. We turn it off and we pitch a fit, because everything has to be perfect now, because that's what we've adapted to. But again, our generation, we remember what it was like to not have these things. And most of the time, I just want to get back to that. And for good reason, because back in those days, things were so much simpler. There was so much less to worry about, and your mind was free. That's the big thing. Your mind was free. You were able to think clearly. You were able to think for yourself. You didn't have all these external factors telling you what you should be thinking. You weren't constantly distracted. But that's the great thing that we're overlooking, is that if we want that freedom and we want that clarity, all we have to do is get back to the old ways of doing things. We have to remove ourselves from this new way of doing things, this new timeline that we're on, and adopt the old things back into our lives. Get outside more. Get the sunlight on your face. Walk around outside. Make mistakes. Get dirty. Stick your bare feet in the dirt. Play with your dog outside. Play with your kids outside. Start a garden and grow your own food. Maybe bust out the old Nintendo. Play that instead of scrolling social media, because back then we thought Nintendo and video games were going to destroy society, but now it looks like social media is going to. Things have changed. And honestly, I can't help but feel bad for the younger generation, because they will never experience the old world like we experienced it. Over the last 20 years, I've traveled all over this country, and I can tell you that I don't see kids outside playing in their yards, doing the things that we used to do when we were kids. They're not outside riding bikes, playing in the yard with their friends. They're not getting dirty. They're not experiencing the real world. And that's a real shame, and I really don't think kids understand what they're missing out on by not doing these things. But again, that's our new world, and that is just how things are now. So if you feel like I do, and you're having a hard time relating and adapting to this new way of doing things, think about your childhood and how peaceful it was. And think about all the things that you're doing in your daily life today that you weren't back then. And of those things that you're doing, is there anything that you can stop doing so that you can try to usher in that peace and that freedom that we all used to feel, that drive and ambition that we all used to have, and more importantly, that clarity and the independence that we all used to feel because we were so much less distracted. Our generation was a generation of brick cell phones. You remember these things? I'm sure you can relate to this. This is my first cell phone. Bought this in 2003. Used to have Snake on this thing. I'd play this for like 10 minutes straight. Didn't have a camera on here though. It's like 5 pixels on this screen. Super high definition there. And then I moved up and I got this bad old Sprint. Had to pull out antenna. Still no camera. 10 pixels on this one. What's good, bub? And then from here, moved up again. Got this Nokia. It's my first cell phone with a camera. Didn't have a pull-out antenna. Technology is a little better. 20 pixels probably on this screen. Yeah, it's good. You were high rolling if you had this. But then, I know you remember these. Razor phone. Camera. The screen was actually about 20 pixels. It was a little better. This is the start of all of it right here. The technology we have in cell phones today, it's what started every bit of it. I'm thinking about going back to this because you still had the internet on here, but you didn't have all the social media and all the crap that we have on our phones today. So I'm thinking about switching from this big old brick, because I don't need all that stuff on there anyway, going back to this. This is simple ways of doing things right here, ladies and gentlemen. It's what we need to get back to.